From New York, this is Democracy Now!
Two men lost their lives standing up to somebody spewing hateful words directed at Muslim passengers on an afternoon commuter train. These two men died heroes as a result of a horrific act of racist violence, and another man was injured.
Retired Army veteran Ricky Best and recent college graduate Taliesin Mirden Namkai Mechi were fatally stabbed in Portland, Oregon Friday, with a third man critically injured as they all tried to defend two teenage girls against an Islamophobic attack on the Portland light rail. One of the girls was wearing a hijab. Their attacker, Jeremy Joseph Christian, who's white, shouted ethnic and religious slurs at them. We'll speak with Heidi Beirich, Intelligence Project Director of the Southern Poverty Law Center, who's been monitoring racially motivated attacks and hate groups in the United States under President Trump. Then, is the United States slipping into tyranny?
From this day forward, it's going to be only America first. America first.
Donald Trump has referred to federal judges as so-called judges, called journalists enemies of the people, and insisted on America first. We'll speak with Yale history professor Timothy Snyder about his new book on tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century.
The framers of the Constitution were worried that someone might come along at some point who could be elected president. This was precisely their worry, who didn't have concern about the rule of law or about democracy. We are now in that situation. Up until now, there is nothing in Mr. Trump's words or in his actions which would convince us, or which would even suggest that he cares even a little bit about democracy or about the rule of law.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Trump has returned to the United States after his first foreign trip as president, where Trump faced condemnation from U.S. allies for his failure to commit the United States to fulfilling its pledges to the landmark 2015 Paris Climate Accord, among other issues. This is German Chancellor Angela Merkel speaking on Sunday after contentious meetings at NATO in Brussels and a G7 meeting in Sicily.
Wie lang und wie steinig dieser Weg wird, das wurde gerade auch.
How long and how rocky this path will be became clear at the G7 talks at the weekend when no agreement was reached with the United States. And that is why I had to say that the consultations were very unsatisfying.
Zufriedenstellend waren. Natürlich Deutschland ein enger Partner der Vereinigten Staaten.
Germany is, of course, a close partner of the United States. We are and will stay convinced transatlanticists, but we also know that we Europeans really have to take our destiny into our own hands.
The German foreign minister went even further, saying of Trump, quote, anyone who accelerates climate change by weakening environmental protection, who sells more weapons in conflict zones, and who does not want to politically resolve religious conflicts is putting peace in Europe at risk, unquote. Meanwhile, French President Emmanuel Macron has said he was trying to convey a deeper significance to his long, clenched, white-knuckled handshake with President Trump in Brussels, saying it was, quote, not innocent, and that, quote, we must show that we will not make small concessions, even symbolic ones, unquote. President Trump says he'll make a final decision about whether to pull the United States out of the 2015 Paris Climate Accord this week. Back on Capitol Hill, President Trump and his administration are facing mounting questions about Trump's son-in-law and senior advisor Jared Kushner, who's now a focus of investigations into whether Trump's campaign colluded with Russia to allegedly influence the 2016 election. The New York Times reports in mid-December, Jared Kushner met with Russian banker Sergei Gorkov, who was under U.S. sanctions, as part of Kushner's efforts to establish a secret back channel with Russia after the election. The meeting is now reportedly being probed by federal and congressional investigators. Trump himself blasted news reports over the weekend about Kushner's attempts to establish a secret back channel with Russia. tweeting, quote, "Whenever you see the words sources say in the fake news media and they don't mention names, it's very possible that those sources don't exist but are made up by fake news writers. Fake news is the enemy," unquote. This was part of Trump's first controversial tweet storm in more than a week. Trump had refrained from incendiary tweets during his trip abroad. Meanwhile, CNN's reporting, based on unnamed former intelligence officials, that U.S. spies intercepted Russian officials discussing having potentially derogatory information about Trump and his top aides during the 2016 campaign. A White House spokesman has denied the report. All this comes as Trump's communication director, Michael Dubke, has resigned. In Syria, a monitoring group says U.S.-led airstrikes killed more than 100 civilians, including 47 children Thursday and Friday in the ISIS-held town of al-Mayadeen in eastern Syria. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says the 2 rounds of strikes targeted the families of ISIS fighters and that the vast majority of the victims were civilian women and their children. The U.S.-led coalition has acknowledged launching the airstrikes on the town. In Iraq, as many as 27 people have died after ISIS militants detonated a car bomb outside an ice cream parlor as families were gathering to break their Ramadan fast early Tuesday. Meanwhile, thousands of families continue to flee Mosul and amidst the U.S. and Iraqi military's campaign to retake the city from ISIS. Over the weekend, U.S.-led airstrikes on Old Mosul reportedly killed at least 15 civilians, including women and children. As many as 700,000 civilians have already fled Mosul amidst months of fighting. Egypt's launched airstrikes targeting militant camps in eastern Libya following a shooting rampage that killed 24 Coptic Christians on a bus heading to a monastery south of Cairo. The airstrikes came as family members held funerals for the victims of Friday's attack.
This is the result of only one thing: negligence. Negligence. Negligence from the government for not punishing these people. Negligence from the government for not punishing those in prison. We are not asking for them to be killed. We are asking for them to be tried fairly. These are killers and murderers. What did the victims do? What did we do for our children to become orphans?
In Sri Lanka, more than 180 people have been killed and 500,000 people displaced amidst the worst flooding in Sri Lanka in the last 14 years. Search and rescue teams are looking for more than 100 people who are still missing. Scientists have linked torrential rains and increased flooding in Sri Lanka to climate change. Meanwhile, flooding in northern Brazil has killed at least 6 people and displaced more than 30,000 others from their homes. This comes as Brazil was rocked by a new wave of protests Sunday demanding the ouster of President Michel Temer over charges of corruption. To see our interview with the ousted president, Dilma Rousseff, go to DemocracyNow.org. In Colombia, authorities have agreed to invest tens of millions of dollars in new hospitals, highways and infrastructure in the state of Choco following a massive 18-day civic strike by residents of the port city of Buenaventura. The strike prevented hundreds of thousands of tons of cargo from reaching the port. Meanwhile, a nationwide strike by teachers in Colombia is continuing into its 3rd week as teachers demand better pay and working conditions and more investment in education for students. In Spain, taxi workers have launched a nationwide strike today to protest Uber and other Wall Street-backed ride-hailing services. The strike comes after thousands rallied in Madrid Saturday to protest austerity measures, demonstrating under the slogan, "Bread, Work, a Roof, and Equality." More than 1,000 Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails have ended their 40-day hunger strike after Israeli authorities reportedly agreed to compromise on a slew of prisoner demands. The Palestinian Prisoner Solidarity Network says up to 80% of the prisoners' demands had been met, including increased family visitation rights, more access to telephones, more education for child prisoners, and better ventilation in overcrowded prisons. Family members of prisoners celebrated the end of the hunger strike, which was declared on the eve of Ramadan.
Thank God, a greeting to the prisoners in the holy month of Ramadan, the month of blessing. May God keep you healthy and make you stronger until you are free from the prison. Our prisoners, our lovers, we hope that you always stay well.
In Afghanistan, at least 18 people were killed in a Taliban suicide bombing on the first day of Ramadan. Officials say the attack in Khost province was targeting Afghan security forces, but that the victims were mainly civilian. In Morocco, protest leader Nasser Zefzafi has been arrested following nationwide protests Sunday night. Zevzafi has emerged as the leader of an economic justice movement that was sparked by the death of fish seller Mucin Fikri, who was crushed to death in the compactor of a garbage truck while he was trying to retrieve fish confiscated by police in the northern city of Al Hoceima last October. Back in the United States, in Portland, Oregon, more than 1,000 people gathered for a vigil Saturday to honor retired Army veteran Ricky Best and the recent college graduate Tulushin Merdin Damkri Mechi, who were fatally stabbed as they tried to defend two girls against an Islamophobic attack on a commuter train Friday. The two young women, one of whom wore a Muslim hijab, were riding the Portland light rail when Jeremy Joseph Christian, who's white, started shouting ethnic and religious slurs at them. When Best and Mechi intervened, Christian stabbed them, as well as a third man who is critically injured but has survived. This is 16-year-old Destiny Magnum, one of the victims of the attack, describing it.
He told us to go back to Saudi Arabia, and he told us that we shouldn't be here and to get out of his country. He was just telling us that we basically weren't anything and that we should just kill ourselves. This white male from the back of us came and he was like, he's talking to you guys, and he was like, you guys, you can't disrespect these young ladies like that. And then they just all started arguing. Me and my friend, we were going to get off the max. And then we turned around while they were fighting, and he just started stabbing people, and it was just blood everywhere. And we just started running for our lives.
Following the attack, Portland Mayor Ted Wheeler has announced Portland will not issue new permits to alt-right groups for planned white supremacist rallies in June. We'll have more on the Portland attack after headlines. Meanwhile, here in New York City, leading Palestinian-American organizer Linda Sarsour is facing a barrage of death threats ahead of her scheduled commencement speech at the City University of New York School of Public Health this Thursday. Sarsour was the co-organizer of the National Women's March and the former head of the Arab American Association of New York. Last week, white supremacist Milo Yiannopoulos led a protest against Sarsour outside CUNY's main office. CUNY's chancellor says he will not cancel her speech. In Minnesota, St. Anthony police officer Geronimo Yanez is going on trial this week on charges of manslaughter for killing African-American Philando Castile during a traffic stop last year. It's the first time in at least 30 years a police officer in Minnesota has faced charges for killing someone while on duty, and comes after nationwide demonstrations protesting Castile's killing. In Texas, hundreds of protesters flooded the gallery in the Texas House on Monday to protest the anti-immigrant bill known as SB 4. The law bans sanctuary cities and allows police officers to check the immigration status of anyone they detain. The protest sparked scuffles between state lawmakers after Republican State Representative Matt Rinaldi said he called the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency on protesters, reportedly Hispanic lawmakers, quote, "I'm glad I just called ICE to have all these people deported," unquote. Immigration activists also held a noisy 3 a.m. protest outside Texas Governor Greg Abbott's mansion on Sunday morning with a blaring mariachi band and signs reading, "You've disturbed our peace, so we're disturbing yours." A new investigation by The Intercept reveals how international private security firm Tiger Swan targeting Dakota Access water protectors with military-style counterterrorism measures. Tiger Swan began as a U.S. military and State Department contractor. It was hired by Energy Transfer Partners, the company behind the pipeline. The investigation's based on leaked internal documents which show how Tiger Swan collaborated closely with law enforcement agencies to surveil and target the nonviolent indigenous-led movement. In the documents, the company also repeatedly calls the water protectors insurgents and the movement an ideologically driven insurgency. And former Panama military dictator Manuel Noriega has died at the age of 83. Noriega was an ally of the U.S. government until the U.S. invaded Panama in 1989 and was convicted of drug trafficking in 91. He spent nearly 20 years in U.S. prisons before being extradited to France and finally back to Panama. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. We begin the show on this day after Memorial Day in Portland, where for the second time in a week, a military man was killed by a white extremist. On Friday, 53-year-old Ricky Best, a retired Army veteran, and 23-year-old Tule Shin Miran Namkai Mechi were fatally stabbed, with a third man critically injured as they tried to defend two teenage girls against an attack by a man going on an anti-Muslim rant. The two young women, one of whom wore a Muslim hijab, were riding a commuter train when, according to witnesses, Jeremy Joseph Christian started shouting ethnic and religious slurs. Best and Mechi were, along with a third man who intervened, were stabbed. Best died at the scene. Mechi died at a hospital. Portland Police Department spokesperson Pete Simpson described the scene.
Officers at the platform went down onto the train. They found one male victim suffering from traumatic injuries. They attempted life-saving measures there on the train, but they were unsuccessful. That victim died here at the scene. Two additional stabbing victims were located and immediately transported by medical personnel. One of those victims, when they arrived at the hospital, also passed away. The third victim is at the hospital being treated. He is suffering from what are believed to be non-life-threatening injuries.
In an emotional interview with CNN, 16-year-old Destiny Magnum, one of the targets of Christians' hate speech, described what happened. Magnum, who is not Muslim, thanked the three strangers who saved their lives.
He told us to go back to Saudi Arabia, and he told us that we shouldn't be here and to get out of his country. He was just telling us that we basically weren't anything and that we should just kill ourselves. This white male from the back of us came and he was like, he's talking to you guys, and he was like, you guys, you can't disrespect these young ladies like that. And then they just all started arguing. Me and my friend, we were gonna get off the max, and then we turned around while they were fighting, and he just started stabbing people, and it was just blood everywhere, and we just started running for our lives. I just want to say thank you to the people who put their life on the line for me, because they didn't even know me, and they lost their lives because of me and my friend and the way we looked. And I just want to say thank you to them and their family, and that I appreciate them, because without them, we probably would be dead right now.
The attack unfolded hours before the start of Ramadan, Islam's holy month, when most of the world's 1.6 billion Muslims observe a daily religious fast. Police arrested Christian, a convicted felon, soon after the attack. He was booked on 2 counts of aggravated murder and charges of attempted murder, intimidation, and being a felon in possession of a restricted weapon. Christian was ordered held without bail, is scheduled to be arraigned today. Following the attack, the Portland mayor, Ted Wheeler, announced the city will not issue permits to alt-right groups for planned white supremacist rallies in June. The attack comes just 6 days after 23-year-old Richard Collins III, an African-American student at Bowie State University and Army second lieutenant in Maryland, was fatally stabbed by an alleged member of a white supremacist Facebook group called Alt-Right Nation. Well, for more, we're joined by Heidi Beirich. She's Intelligence Project Director of the Southern Poverty Law Center. Heidi, welcome to Democracy Now!, joining us from Montgomery, Alabama. Can you tell us what you know about this attack and about this man who will be arraigned today?
Yes, well, Jeremy Christian, based on extensive Facebook postings, was motivated by pro-Hitler ideas, a love of the Oklahoma City bomber, Timothy McVeigh, other extremist ideas in particular related to the Islamic faith. And it looks like, for some reason, he decided to act out on those anti-Muslim ideas. He was also a Trump supporter who had shown up at Trump rallies, Zeke Heiling at one of these events. So he's a true radical in terms of his ideas.
Well, some people have suggested that the incident fits into the broader pattern or the history of neo-Nazi violence in the Northwest. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, look, the Northwest has been victimized by neo-Nazis and skinheads for a very, very long time. And this also has involved murders of people of color and anti-racist activists. There's no question. Neo-Nazis have tried to move into that region for years to create a homeland, thinking that because it has a white population, that'd be a good place to be. But what I find interesting about Jeremy Christian is, although some of those ideas are there in his writings, in many ways, I think his rhetoric has more to do with the campaign and the ideas unleashed in the campaign over the last 16, 18 months by the Trump folks than it does with hardcore neo-Nazism, or at least it's a mix of the two sets of ideas.
Jeremy Christian's Facebook page includes several posts in which he espouses extremist views. On April 19th, the anniversary of the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing, Christian praised Oklahoma City bomber Timothy McVeigh, writing, "May all the gods bless Timothy McVeigh, a true patriot." In a post dated May 9th, Christian wrote, "I just challenge Ben Ferencz, last living Nuremberg persecutor, to a debate in The Hague with Putin as our judge. I will defend the Nazis, and he will defend the Ashkenazis," a reference to European Jews. Heidi, can you talk about this?
Yeah, well, look, the praise of McVeigh is particularly troubling. You know, people sometimes forget that McVeigh, who was directly inspired to commit that bombing in 1995 by reading a neo-Nazi novel called The Turner Diaries, that was the largest domestic terrorist attack prior to 9/11. And there have been many, many people who have praised McVeigh over the years. We had an incident actually just in the past week in Tampa in which 4 neo-Nazis, one of whom converted to Islam and then killed 2 of his roommates, had bomb-making material, a very serious incident. There was a picture of McVeigh in their room. And so when you're praising McVeigh, what you're talking about is killing people. And you're talking about being inspired by white supremacy. And, you know, we also had the incident in Maryland where this black man was killed by someone who was involved in a neo-Nazi, you know, so-called alt-right group. So we're seeing a lot of this right now. It's actually quite scary.
I want to turn to Portland Mayor Ted Wheeler. Speaking Monday, Wheeler urged white supremacist groups to cancel their plans for upcoming demonstrations in Portland.
Our city is in mourning. Our community's anger is very real. And the timing and subject of these events can only exacerbate what is already a very difficult situation. I'm appealing to the organizers of the alt-right events to cancel the events that they've scheduled on both June 4th and June 10th. I urge them to ask their supporters to stay away from Portland at this difficult time. There is never a place for bigotry or hatred in our community, and especially not right now.
This comes as the top Republican in Portland said he's considering using militia groups as security for public events. Meanwhile, Multnomah County GOP Chair James Buchel told The Guardian that Republicans could make their own security arrangements rather than relying on city or state police, including groups like the Oath Keepers and the 3 Percenters. This comes as a video recently surfaced of Buchel lamenting what he called open borders.
His enemies are my enemies, and his enemies are all our enemies. Our enemies want a lot of things that are bad for us. Above all else, they want open borders, because they know if they keep the borders open and bring in all sorts of people from third world countries who have no conception of liberty, they have no experience with liberty, many of them may not even be interested in it. If they keep doing that, it will change this country forever. And it will destroy everything that is special about America. And this election was very important because our enemies were on the verge of winning, essentially permanently. 8 more years of this, and that may well have been the end. And then Trump got elected. So now our enemies are more dangerous than ever. They're more ruthless than ever. They're more determined than ever. We are really in a life and death battle for the future of our society.
That was Multnomah County GOP Chair James Buchel. I wanted to, Heidi Byrick, your response.
Yeah, well, I mean, those are outrageous claims related to bringing in militias and whatnot. You have to wonder if these folks don't realize that it just wasn't that long ago that militia groups took over a wildlife refuge in a very, very dangerous, situation in eastern Oregon. And, to hear, on the one hand, the mayor calling for calm and, honoring the victims and so on, then have somebody else from the GOP side calling to have militias brought out is just, frankly, frightening.
I wanted to get your response to the ACLU of Oregon saying that Mayor Ted Wheeler's efforts to keep far-right protesters from holding more rallies in Portland is an unconstitutional violation of the First Amendment, Heidi.
Yeah, I think the ACLU is actually right in that case. We have to protect people's First Amendment rights regardless of how heinous they are. I can understand the mayor being upset and not wanting to see more hate in his town, but this is probably the wrong tactic to take. A better one would be to continue with the positive events like the vigils that took place over this past weekend, which draw attention to the better parts of our nature and allow these other folks to have their events. Unfortunately, their hate will be on parade during them.
I want to ask you also about how long it took President Trump to respond to these attacks. It was only on Monday that he tweeted, quote, "The violent attacks in Portland on Friday are unacceptable. The victims were standing up to hate and intolerance. Our prayers are with them."
You know, President Trump, whose words in the campaign against immigrants, against Muslims, against others, unleashed a wave of hate crimes and bias incidents, especially right after the election. The SPLC had documented about 900 of them in the first 10 days. He's been incredibly reluctant to denounce the hate violence that in many cases has been perpetrated in his name. And this is another example where he waits several days, and then this tweet only went out on the official President of the United States account, not from the Twitter account that he usually fiddles with. You know, he didn't mention the Jewish population during his Holocaust Remembrance Day speech. It's outrageous that he won't stand up and denounce these hate crimes, given the role that he's played in stoking the anger out there.
What about the Trump administration's proposal to cut all funding for the Department of Homeland Security program known as Countering Violent Extremism? Can you explain more what that program is and why the Trump administration is trying to get rid of it?
Sure. So under the Obama years, the Countering Violent Extremism set of programs gave money basically to Muslim groups that were fighting extremism in their community, and then in the latter years of the Obama administration to organizations battling against white supremacy. Of course, the understanding was extremism comes in both those forms, so both need to be fought. Now, Trump, kind of in the way that he doesn't seem to realize that there's a wave of hate crimes breaking out across this country based on racist and white supremacist ideas, it appears that he wants to cut the part of the Countering Violent Extremism program devoted to battling white supremacy. It's as though domestic terrorism doesn't come from white supremacist ideas, when in fact in the United States the bulk in recent years of domestic terrorist incidents have not been inspired by radical interpretations of Islam, but by white supremacy, which is frankly an indigenous thought process that goes back deep into our history. And like I said, we've just had 3 incidents, Maryland, Tampa, and now Portland, that show how dangerous and violent these ideas can become.
Heidi Beirich, we want to thank you very much for being with us, Intelligence Project Director of the Southern Poverty Law Center, speaking to us from Montgomery, Alabama. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, Yale University professor Tim Snyder on tyranny, 20 lessons from the 20th century. Stay with us.
Oh, I'm sailing away, my own true love, and I'm sailing away in the morning. Is there something I can send you from across the sea, from the place that I'll be landing? No, there's nothing you can send me, my own true love. There's nothing I'm wishing to be owning. Just carry yourself back to me unspoiled from across that lonesome ocean. Oh, but I just thought you might want something fine, made of silver or of golden, either from the mountains of Madrid or from the
Boots of Spanish Leather, performed by Carolyn Hester. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We spend the rest of the hour with award-winning author and Yale University history professor Timothy Snyder, whose new book draws on his decades of experience writing about war and genocide in European history in order to find lessons that can help the United States avoid descending into fascist authoritarianism. It is titled On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century.
Professor Snyder writes, quote, "The Founding Fathers tried to protect us from the threat they knew, the tyranny that overcame ancient democracy. Today, our political order faces new threats, not unlike the totalitarianism of the 20th century. We're no wiser than the Europeans who saw democracy yield to fascism, Nazism, or communism. Our one advantage is that we might learn from their experience." That's from On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century by Timothy Snyder, Levin Professor of History at Yale University, where he joins us now. Professor Snyder is also the author of Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin, as well as Black Earth, the Holocaust as History and Warning. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Timothy Snyder. Can you talk about, well, just what we quoted you saying there? Do you think that the United States is headed towards tyranny?
So I guess the place to start would be with a quotation. Like the framers of the Constitution, I'm not an American exceptionalist. I'm a skeptic. My tendency is to look at examples from other places and to ask what we could learn. The point of using the historical examples is to remind ourselves that democracies and republics usually fail. The expectation should be failure rather than success. The framers, looking at classical examples from Greece and Rome, gave us the institutions that we have. I think our mistake at present is to imagine that the institutions will automatically continue to protect us. My sense is that we've seen institutions like our own fail. 20th century authoritarians have learned that the way to dismantle systems like ours is to go after one institution and then the next, which means that we have to have an active relationship both to history so that we can see how failure arises and learn from people who try to protect institutions, but also an active relationship to our own institutions, that our institutions are only as good as the people who try to serve them.
Well, Professor Snyder, in terms of the rise of tyranny in the 20th century, clearly the rise of fascism came in the period after World War I. The masses of people in the world have been exposed to these imperialist wars, and there was tremendous insecurity. Do you see, what parallels do you see between that period in the 30s and our situation today?
That's a wonderful question, because it helps us see how history can brace us, can give us a kind of grounding. When we think about globalization today, we imagine that it's the first globalization, that everything about it is new. And that's just not the case. The globalization we're in now is the second one. The first globalization was the late 19th century and the early 20th century, when there was a similar expansion of world trade, export-led growth. And interestingly, there was also a similar rhetoric of optimism. The idea that trade would lead to enlightenment, would lead to liberalism, would lead to peace. That pattern of the late 19th century, we saw it break. We saw the First World War, as you say, the Great Depression, the Second World War. One way to understand all of that is the long failure of the first globalization. Once we have that in mind, we shouldn't be surprised that our own globalization has contradictions, has opponents, that it generates opposition, that it generates ideas of the far right, sometimes the far left, that are against it. So history instructs us that there's nothing new or nothing automatic about globalization, but it also instructs us that there are people who lived through the end of that first globalization, the kind of people I cite in the book, Hannah Arendt, Victor Klemperer, who observed these effects and then gave us very practical advice about how we can react. So part of our own misunderstanding of globalization, that it's all new, is that history doesn't matter precisely because it's all new. What I'm trying to say in the book is, no, the opposite. We've seen globalization fail before. We've seen fascism rise. We've seen other threats to liberalism, democracy, republics. What we should be doing is learning from the 20th century rather than forgetting it.
You wrote a Facebook post in November. Tell us what you wrote about when Donald Trump was elected.
Yeah, so, I mean, the thing about the Facebook post, I wrote it right after the election, and it was the first thing that I did, and it was these 20 lessons. It was an attempt to compress everything that I thought I understood about the 20th century into very brief points that would help Americans react, because I had this strong feeling, I think it turned out to be correct, that there would be tens of millions of Americans who would be surprised and disoriented and shocked by the election of Mr. Trump and would be seeking some way to react. And I did it as quickly as I could because it's very important in these kinds of historical moments to get out front. The tendency to, or the temptation to normalize is very strong. The temptation to wait and to say, well, let's see what he does after the inauguration. Let's see who his advisors are. Let's see what the policies are. That temptation generates a normalization, which is already happening in the United States. And so I was trying to get out front and give people very practical day-to-day things that they could do. But what stood behind all of that was a lifetime of working on the worst chapters of European history, a sense of how things can go very wrong. What also stood behind it is my friendships with my teachers and also my students from Eastern Europe, people who have their own biographical connection either to the authoritarianisms of the 20th century or, sadly, the new authoritarianisms of the 21st. It's that a little bit which helps me to see that these kinds of things can happen to people like us, but also that there are practical ways that people like us can respond.
I wanted to ask you about the first lesson you talk about in your book, especially in light of the realities that in our day and age, clearly authoritarianism has enormous more power of surveillance and social control of populations. You write in your first lesson, do not obey in advance. Most of the power of authoritarianism is freely given. In times like these, individuals think ahead about what a more repressive government will want and then offer themselves without being asked. A citizen who adapts in this way is teaching power what it can do. I think about that in terms of the enormous gravitation of the population towards social media and then the ability of states and corporations to actually monitor and control what people say and do and shop and everything they're thinking about.
Yeah, so I agree with that completely. The historical basis of that first lesson, don't obey in advance, is what historians think we understand about authoritarian regime changes, and in particular, the Nazi regime change of 1933. Historians of Nazi Germany disagree about a lot of things, but one of the few things we agree about is the significance of adaptation from below in 1933. When we look at Hitler in retrospect, we sometimes have a tendency to think of him as a kind of supervillain who can do anything. But in fact, the lesson of 1933 is that consent from below matters a lot. Not consent necessarily in the sense of voting or marching or anything active, but consent in the sense of bystanding, going along, making mental adjustments. So the point of don't obey in advance is not to give your consent in that way, which is very important because if you do just drift at the beginning, then psychologically you're lost. Or to put it a different way, if you don't follow lesson 1, don't obey in advance, then you can't follow lessons 2 to 20 either. Politically, it's also really important because the time which matters the most is the beginning, where we are now. Right now, we actually have much more power than we think we do. Our actions are magnified outwards now. When protest becomes illegal or dangerous, this is going to change. But right now, Americans actually have more power than they think they do. And your point actually magnifies all of this. Because one of the reasons you shouldn't obey in advance is that when you do, you're actually giving power ideas. They don't necessarily have plans. They don't necessarily know what they can do. But when we lean towards what they think they want, and social media is a very good example of this, then we give them ideas. We teach them what they can do. So in our real lives and in social media, it's very important not to obey in advance. Because you're absolutely right. That information is being collected and collated and considered.
Number 2, Timothy Snyder, in your 20 lessons from the 20th century, is defend institutions. Explain.
Well, that's the second most important lesson. It's number 2 for a reason. I have in mind, above all, the constitutional institutions, but I also have in mind later on in the book other kinds of institutions like professional or vocational institutions or non-governmental organizations. And the reason why institutions are so important is that they're what prevent us from being those atomized individuals who are alone against the overpowering state. That's a very romantic image, but the isolated individual is always going to lose. We need the constitutional institutions as much as we can get them going. It's a real problem now, especially with the legislature. We also need the professions, whether it's law or medicine or civil servants, to act according to rules that are not the same thing as just following orders. And we need to be able to form ourselves up into non-governmental organizations, because it's not just that we have freedom of association, it's that freedom itself requires association. We need association to have our own ideas confirmed, to have our confidence raised, to be in a position to actually act as individuals. Some of that is actually happening, which is a good sign.
I wanted to ask you about number 9 of your lessons. Be kind to our language, especially, again, in the times in which we are today, where kindness is one of the few things that politicians or academics talk about much.
So I have in mind the necessity of thinking, really, because the way we are now, and this connects back to your earlier question, the way we are now, we're bombarded from the television, from the internet, with whatever tropes and memes are being chosen for us for a given day or for a given hour. And whether we agree or disagree or feel comfortable or uncomfortable, there's a certain tendency to express ourselves in the terms that come down from above. We get caught up in this daily rush. You see this, for example, in people who think they're critical of Trump, but use his language. First, they use it as a joke, and then they find that they can't get themselves out of it. So being kind to the language is one of these lessons that seems easy. It just means read, think, and try to express your views, whether they're for or against, in your own words. Because my very strong sense is that if we have pluralism of expression, we're going to be fostering pluralism of thought. And that if people can clarify why it is that they're opposing this or that, they're going to be more likely to be persuasive. And at a minimum, in the worst case, if you have your own way of expressing yourself, you at least clutter up the daily memes, you at least put a barrier in the way of the daily tropes, you at least form a force field around yourself and maybe the people who are closest to you, where it's possible to think and have a little peace.
We're going to break, then come back to our discussion with Timothy Snyder, professor of history at Yale University, author of the book On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. It's been #1 on the New York Times bestseller list for a long time now. Stay with us. Tusk by Fleetwood Mac here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Our guest is Professor Timothy Snyder. His book, On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. Since taking office, President Trump has continued to escalate his attack on the media, what he calls the fake news. On Sunday, he once again took to Twitter after there was a few days of not tweeting, lambasted the, quote, fabricated lies made up by the fake news media. Trump tweeted, whenever you see the word sources say in the fake news media and they don't mention names, it's very possible these sources don't exist but are made up by fake news writers. Fake news is the enemy. Meanwhile, the New York Times recently revealed in a February Oval Office meeting, President Trump asked then FBI Director James Comey to consider imprisoning journalists who report on leaks of classified information. And this is Trump speaking earlier this year in Melbourne, Florida.
Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, and Abraham Lincoln, and many of our greatest presidents fought with the media and called them out, oftentimes on their lies. When the media lies to people, I will never, ever let them get away with it. I will do whatever I can that they don't get away with it. They have their own agenda, and their agenda is not your agenda.
In fact, while President Jefferson often lambasted the press, he also believed it was fundamental to the functioning of a democratic society, famously writing, the only security of all is in a free press. Timothy Snyder, historian, talk about the attack on the press and how it fits into your thoughts on tyranny.
At the deepest level, I think we should be aware that this is about getting rid of a common sense of truth. Truth is an awkward concept for us these days, and it should probably be a less awkward concept. If we're going to resist all of this, I think we have to take a stand, even if it feels a little bit naive, in favor of the facts. Because what we know about 20th century regime changes are that they involve, at their base, an assault on everyday factuality, whether it's the extreme right fascist idea that facts aren't important, only a sense of collectivity, a belonging to the nation, this organic group is important, or whether it's the extreme left Bolshevik idea that the facts of today have to be sacrificed in the name of a vision tomorrow. We know that all these forms of radical politics have to begin with undermining a sense of everyday factuality. In the 21st century, when ideologies no longer propose a future, what you have is a much more direct attack on factuality, where the first step is to say, the first step is just to lie all the time, as Mr. Trump did in 2016. The second step, as we've seen since late 2016 and into the presidency, is to say it's not me who lies, it's the press, it's the journalists. And the final goal is that everyone is so confused that we say we don't really have truth, we just have our own private clan-like sets of beliefs. And at that point, democracy is not really possible anymore. Opposition is no longer possible because we don't know where to begin. We don't know whom to trust. So, of course, it's an atrocity, and it's a violation of basic American traditions to attack journalists like that. But I think something, if possible, something deeper is at stake. I think that this is a direct and well-understood attempt to transform the regime the easiest and cheapest way possible, which is to make us all distrust one another. Oh, and what I also wanted to say, there is something we can do about this. I mean, there are simple things we can do, like we can support reporters who actually travel and investigate. We can, all of us, subscribe to newspapers and other sources of reliable information. Those seem like easy things to do, but if we all do them, it actually makes a huge difference, morally for the reporters, financially for the sources of good information.
Now, interestingly, in your book, you never mentioned Donald Trump. I'm wondering, was that a deliberate on your part? And also, what responsibility you feel previous administrations, whether it's the Obama administration or the Bush administration, have for the slide or the move toward tyranny and authoritarianism in this country?
Mm-hmm. So let me take that in reverse order. There is an underlying problem, at least one, in this country, and it goes back to our earlier discussion of globalization, and that is inequality, especially fractal inequality. That is, in particular parts of the country, there are unspeakable levels of inequality, and that that sets up the possibility for someone like Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump won by promising all kinds of things he can't deliver. He won by being a good speaker. He won because he had cyber help from foreign powers. There are lots of reasons why he won. But one of the reasons why he could win is that he could say to people, look, it's an oligarchy out there. I'm an oligarch, but I'm your oligarch. Of course, that's not really true. He doesn't care about Americans, and there were plenty of other oligarchs behind him. They just weren't Americans. But you can only tell that story in a situation of radical inequality. And that radical inequality has its roots, I think, in the false story that we've told ourselves since 1989. That history came to an end, that human nature is capitalism, capitalism brings democracy, and so on and so forth. History never comes to an end. We had a moment in 1989 where we needed to reshape things, and I think we've missed that moment, and in that way betrayed younger generations. Now, why don't I mention Mr. Trump? I mean, it's largely because I think he's not going to change. What can change is the system. So Mr. Trump is not a young man. He has very firm sets of ideas. He has a certain kind of personality. And he is going to push against the walls of the system. And some of those walls are already weak. He's going to push and push and push and push because that's what people do. You don't have to have a plan to be an authoritarian. You just have to have a set of instincts, a set of inclinations, and a certain amount of energy. He has all of that. So I'm not trying to change Mr. Trump. What I'm trying to do is alert us, change us. Because if that system is going to be preserved, it's going to be because we hold up the various parts of the structure. So I was trying to get away from what I knew was coming, which is all the personal stuff. You know, is he crazy? You know, can he read? Right? There's certain talents he doesn't have, but there are also certain talents he does. The real question is what we can do. And so the book is meant to be about us much more than about him.
Number 6 in your 20 lessons from the 20th century is be wary of paramilitaries. Talk about this in the current context.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a wonderful example, Amy, of things that we used to know about, for example, National Socialism in Germany, which have obvious application. We just need to make those applications. So one of the ways that not just Hitler, but other ideological authoritarians break republics is that they break the monopoly of violence. That is, you're in what we think of as a normal system is when there's law, and then there are certain organs whose job it is to enforce the law, and those are state organs. What you do if you're Hitler, and other authoritarians have done this too, is you have your own militia, paramilitary, which is an organ of violence which is beyond the state. And you use it to change the atmosphere of politics. You use it to intimidate opponents. And then after you win, you keep it going. That's the story of the SA and the SA and the SA in the SS and the SA in Nazi Germany. So in the current situation, where our society is flooded with guns like none has ever been before, and where there are lots of paramilitaries, it's very important to watch out for the connection of those paramilitaries to politics. So, for example, if an elected representative or an important politician in, let's say, Oregon says, we ought to bring in paramilitaries rather than the police when we have our own demonstrations, that's something to really watch out for. Likewise, in the firing of Mr. Comey, of which there were so many desperately bad things that it's easy to overlook some of them, one of the things which was striking in the firing of Mr. Comey by Mr. Trump is that he sent Keith Schiller to do it, right? So here you had a confrontation of the man who was the head of Mr. Trump's security detail, right, his own paramilitary, going to fire the head of a law enforcement agency. That's a sign of the way Mr. Trump thinks, and it's obviously not a very good sign.
I wanted to ask you, there was another one of your lessons, lesson 12, make eye contact and small talk. That would seem like not a strong way to battle authoritarianism, but your thoughts about that?
I love that question because it's really important for us to see that we have power in all kinds of ways that we don't have. So some of the lessons look easy but are in fact hard, like number 1, don't obey in advance. That's actually really hard. Or number 19, be a patriot, also really hard. Some of the ones actually are not that difficult, but they magnify outwards. Like number 4, which is take care of the face of the world, which basically means just paint over swastikas when you see them. That's not that hard when you get to do it, if you can get yourself to do it, but it does make a difference. So small talk is a little bit like that. Small talk and eye contact are important for a number of reasons. One is that, I mean, going back to the news story above all this, you have to be, you don't know who feels left out, who feels threatened, but if you are more pleasant or more affirming to everybody in your daily life, you are going to make a difference. And the reason why this is so close to my heart is that in all the memoirs, Jewish memoirs, say, of Nazi Germany, but also memoirs of the terror and Stalinist Soviet Union, there's that moment when people start crossing the street rather than talking to you. And that's the moment we have to avoid, both for the sake of the political atmosphere, but also for the sake of what kind of people we want to be. But the small talk is also really important because one of the deep problems where we are in our own sort of postmodern authoritarianism is that we spend too much time on the internet, we spend too much time in front of screens, we forget how to talk to one another, and that human contact can be very important. I mean, one thing, personally, which suggests to me this is right, is the difference between last fall and this spring. Like last fall, I talked to a lot of people in other parts of the country, in the Midwest, for example, about what I thought was going on, and I got basically zero resonance. But the fact that I talked to people as opposed to just posting something online, which can be important too, means that now sometimes people come back to me and say, oh, yes. So you never convince anybody with small talk, but you do sometimes demonstrate that you're a human being and that you're not the enemy and that maybe at some future point there could be some better conversation.
I wanted to ask you, Professor Snyder, about President Trump in Brussels and Sicily, the NATO meeting, the G7 meeting. Trump sparked outrage in Montenegro after he shoved the Prime Minister of Montenegro out of his way while barreling to the front of the pack at this weekend's G7 summit. This came after French President, the new president, Emmanuel Macron, clenched Trump's hand until his knuckle turned white when the two met in Brussels during the NATO summit. Even when Trump attempted to pull away, Macron continued to grip Trump's hand. He's since said the handshake was a moment of truth designed to send a message to Trump saying, quote, "We must show that we will not make small concessions, even symbolic ones." Can you comment on this? And then on your number 18, which is become when the unthinkable arrives.
Okay. So Europe is so important for us. Whether you care about trade and American jobs, it's the biggest market in the history of the world. Whether you're more, whether you think more about security, these are America's long-term partners. It's the only reliable set of democracies, or the main reliable set of democracies we have. In many ways, Europe is a positive example for us. It is tragic that we are cutting ourselves off from that market, from that security, from those sets of values for no particular reason. It fits many things. It fits Mr. Trump's desire for an America which is more isolated and frankly poorer. It fits Mr. Bannon's ideas about the European Union. What it doesn't fit is, I think, anybody's interests. The Europeans are seeing us, as one of my political scientist friends puts it, we're no longer in column A, we're in column B. We are now one of the powers which is undermining them, perhaps weakening them, setting a bad example. And the heartening thing is that people like Angela Merkel or Macron notice this and seem to be taking it as a reason to try to recreate Europe rather than just being distressed about all of this. That's a positive thing. Now, there's no good segue to your next question, which is about terrorism and talk about terrorism. So the last 4 lessons of the book, which are about beware certain kinds of language, be calm when the unthinkable arrives, be a patriot, be courageous, they have to do with a particular mechanism where regimes change. The template is the Reichstag fire of 1933. Pretty much, I think it's fair to say, all modern tyrants know that
15 seconds.
Okay, that they need a moment of fear of terrorism to make a regime change. So in the atmosphere we have now with Mr. Trump, we have to be aware that when something unthinkable happens, despite our fear and grief, what we have to be protesting for is our own rights.
Professor Timothy Snyder, thanks so much for being with us. Yale historian, author of On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. And that does it for our show. Welcome to the world, Muriel Lau-Burke, the daughter of our news director, Mike Burke, and his wife, Michelle Lau-Burke. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.